Is being recorded.
Okay, welcome everyone to this week's OMR Architecture Meeting. This is likely our last meeting of the year. On the agenda for today, we have one topic. Shelley Lambert will be talking about some ideas she has for testing the various OMR components and some of the things that she'd like to get done in 2020. So I'll turn it over to Shelley.
Great, thank you. And I'll just share my screen because I have some slides. I've already apologized before the recording heard, I guess, that this is a very preliminary look at or revisiting some of the stuff that's happening in OMR test. It doesn't include everything, but it's certainly a start. And for the benefit of everyone, I guess I'd also like to go back in time briefly, back to 2014, to explain why things are the way they are for those of people on the project that look at FV test and go, why? and how it all started. So I'm going to just dive right in. Trying to quickly cover just a bit of the background of the QA prep work that happened as the OMR project was open sourced. Then, really what I think the goals of a QA effort in this open project are, in my opinion. Hopefully everyone agrees or at least has some input and feedback. And then a specific list of things that I'd like to get to in 2020, and it's a pretty modest list because the team is kind of spread thinly across many open source projects. So I went for the realistic view, looking at that list. But obviously, if we got through all of it in the middle of the year, we'd start adding more stuff. So first, back to 2014, we looked at what needed to be done for QA in newly forming OMR project. We knew we'd need some sort of framework that was integrated into the OMR source. We knew we needed to design some tests for testing the functionality, and we knew we had to then implement the design that we had for tests. Looking at the test infrastructure, that involved us selecting and establishing the framework you have today. So we actually looked at a bunch of them and decided to go with Google Test because it seemed to have all the features that we were looking for in a very full-featured framework that could be expanded and extended for many uses. Also, we needed, as the OMR project does, to be able to run tests on all platform, be completely lab independent, as in be able to unpack anywhere with nothing mounted, that kind of thing. We wanted it to be easy to use and add and disable tests. We wanted to make sure there was acceptable functional coverage. So, and how that actually worked was we ran code coverage at the very beginning where there were no tests, zero coverage, and then checked in a couple of times through the prep work. So we have actual code coverage numbers over the course of those few months that we had enabled to prepare this stuff. And I'll get to that again at the kind of end of this talk and going in 2020. Also, obviously, framework needed to be integrated into OMR source. Actually, this isn't completely true. This is true right now because of how it is necessary to run on ZOS and how there was some kind of hinky changes that needed to happen to run on that platform. I think we could revisit this too, but I didn't put it on 2020 list. And then finally, being able to build the tests as part of an OMR build, taking us through the infrastructure portion. Did I get too far? Okay, so for design, we looked at, the way we thought about the OMR project was by subcomponent. At the time, at the very early time in 2014, I remember people in the project saying how each subcomponent could be standalone. You could pick and choose which subcomponents. I'm not sure that that's true today, but at the time that was part of what was being said. So we wanted to make sure that the unit tests were separated out by component in case someone only needed to run a certain set of tests, only picking those up. So we just stuck with that kind of organization. Again, that can be now revisited. I know there's an open issue around reorganizing and renaming the way tests are laid out, and I want to be part of that conversation. We also, for a lot of the components, use combinatorial test design, closely with the development teams on this for some of the components. I'll say that some other components like port and thread, those components, since we were trying to go very quickly with very few resources, what we did with those was essentially just make sure we had functional coverage with the existing tests that we had from our internal repos. So if people remember port test and thread test executables that used to run, those essentially got ported very quickly, not in a very clean way, over into the Google test framework to be run in OMR. And I guess I just mentioned this here. On the upside, the RAS component was modeled quite thoroughly back when Angela was part of the team, very closely. GC, we actually have a very interesting way of being able to write new tests, or we did. Again, I'm going to work closely with Rob and Andrew and others around this, hopefully this year. Right now, the way we have some of the testing for GC is you actually create configuration files that you can feed in, and it will run some tests based on a file. And I'm going to touch on that when we talk about the performance tests as well for that. And then for the JIT side of things, Mark probably remembers this way back in 2014. We worked closely with Mark and Shaoli and Daryl to help implement those very initial opcode tests. I think there were more than 500 of them. Now I see some nice work to get those moved over into Trill. But that was how we got involved on that component. Okay. Still running through here. Oh, okay. So the implementation part was make sure we had some sort of structure and naming approach. Again, that can be revisited at any point, but we needed something. We identified which of the existing tests we had that could be reused. We ported the reusable tests into the Google test framework, and then we wrote a bunch of new tests where there were gaps. And then that all was done prior to open sourcing and all came in as one giant directory into the project. Okay, so that's the past. When I think of what are the goals of QA in an OMR project, why are we testing OMR code? Obviously, one of the big reasons to find defects, to ensure that things are functionally correct. But there are other reasons one would want to actually test code, which is why I want to come back to that whole perf test story. There's nothing really going on right now. I don't believe those are even being run, but I have it on the list for 2020 to revisit perf test in OMR. The other real goal of a QA team and a QA effort should be to support developers. So make it easy to run testing, make sure testing has covers the things that the development team are most concerned about or feel that there's most risk around. If we have very limited resources, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the things that the development team feels needs the most attention. I think that's about the only right approach here. build confidence so that people can innovate and deliver more quickly without worry. And then finally, a kind of unspoken goal of QA in any project is to help encourage participation and interest from people that aren't yet involved in the project. So just very quickly to the list, not a thorough list, but I think this is when I looked at how much time I might have and the team might have, probably this is the realistic list. Adding test documentation for existing testing. So that includes, I think, and I'm gonna grab my, look at here. So this is the website right now if you go under testing. So obviously I'd like to get some more stuff in and around this piece. If we go into the repo, there's 0 READMEs right now. We actually, I believe, even began this work and never did get it delivered to the project. So there are partial READMEs that I can contribute already, but I will revisit everything because there's probably a lot of stale information. Then we have, of course, the review of the port-lib and thread-lib tests. This is where we left off with this piece, was that there wasn't full coverage. I'd like to see coverage on every piece of these APIs if possible. So rerunning some of the code coverage stuff, looking at the existing set. I think there's also an opportunity here to sort of call some of the tests that's in there. So kind of thorough review of these tests would be the next item on the list. So I've ordered this in terms of the most obvious and the easiest, the most clearly defined work. And as we go down this list, it becomes less and less defined, so a little harder to dig into. The next one is the perf testing. So I already created an issue here, referenced it in the slide. One of the things that we actually used to have running prior to open sourcing OMR was a regular run of these perf tests. And if we look at them right now, they actually, I believe they only include the some GC tests, and they're again using the configuration-based testing that we have. And these ones actually are pulling quite a large object model and running through them. They use the verbose GC logs then to verify did we actually achieve what we set out in the test itself in the time frame that was expected. Or what I should say is we output a bunch of metrics, and the piece that's missing here and that we had prototyped internally was let's track it over time. The nice thing about this, and I'll go back to the slide, tracking this stuff over time becomes a lot easier if we make sure that we're using a standard set of output for our benchmarks. So converting the perf testing to use the Google benchmark framework would be step 1. That way, no matter what kind of performance tests we add, we'd be able to use the same tooling to monitor the results over time. And in fact, that tooling exists already. We call it Test Results Summary Service. It's an open source project that we're using heavily to monitor test results from other Jenkins servers. It doesn't matter what Jenkins job you're running. It's easy to add parsers to this service. So we'll be able to add a parser to parse Google benchmark performance output and show that in a graphical way, or at least store stuff over time. So TRSS has a MongoDB on the back end, and we can store a lot of data over time and show trend over time. So right now I'm going to focus on lifting this up for the existing GC tests that we have. I think there's only a couple in there, but I will also start a discussion about the other components to see what other things could we actually measure. So maybe there's something on the threading side that could be measured. What metrics would be interesting? I looked, when we began this project in 2014, we had looked at LLVM, and it was, the testing they had was very preliminary, very, very slight at that time. We're looking now, there's a lot of performance benchmarks that they have in their project. So I think I'd like to more closely revisit what other projects are doing, similar projects maybe to this project, and make a call on can we come at this with a new approach, knowing what we know. Okay, so the other thing I'd like to look at, again, this is in the least defined category, down these last two things on the bottom. The GC testing, right now, those config files can actually be populated by real object models pulled out of cores. And at the time, we had a Java core reader, and we still do, and I'd like to get it into source control somewhere. But I also want to look at, do we have other, for this project, are there other languages or upstream projects that have a similar thing when things crash? Can we look at the artifacts of that and draw from that to create new tests? So that would be one piece. And then in terms of continuing to test suite from existing issues where crashes occurred, we could look at those to see if there's anything interesting. What we found with this reader was we can write these config files by hand and create an object model in them, but they're never quite as interestingly shaped as when we take the object model out of one of these dramatic crashes from users. So we learned quite a bit when we started to use these oddly shaped models from real world use cases. Right, and then finally, kind of the very end, and this has been a conversation I've had with a few people that are on this call already today. Can we define some test mechanisms that help kind of protect OMR developers? In other projects that I'm helping out in the QA side, so I'm going to take an example from another project. So Adopt OpenJDK, producing JDK binaries. The upstream projects of that would be large Java application communities that would consume the binaries. But in our actual QA effort, we include some of those upstream functional suites and application suites, and we run them on a regular basis to make sure things don't fall over. Now that's pretty heavyweight if you have a limited set of resources, but is there something similar that we could do in a more light fashion? So just as a note, we used to run these high-level testing for OMR in the past. We had actual Ruby, Python, and Java tests running internally. But this wouldn't be the only thing we could do here. This is why this is the last bullet point here, the least defined and probably the hardest one to do correctly. I think we talked even about how upstream projects there could be a subscription model. There could be a kind of building relationships with projects so that you could connect with them through QA. So back to the goals and how do we grow interest or participation in the project. So while I don't have this very well defined here, I do want to kind of approach this in 2020 and figure out at least the first steps to that. Okay. And by the way, just for fun, based on that high-level view. This was a diagram back in 2014. We were talking about testing and how we would have the component testing down in the language agnostic layer, base some of the community tests at the language layer, but the goal was always to push as much testing as low as we could, because then you don't have to have as much high-level testing. That is essentially duplication in lots of cases. And I won't go to all these, but if I'll attach the slides to the agenda issue for people to take a look at. Also, we'll be doing a little bit more investigation on some other projects to see what we can glean from our approach, or where we can grow from our approach. So I'll leave those in here, but those are from the past or other sources. So finally, just in summary, I think in my opinion, the QA approach, or the QA approach I'm going to take in this project will be address the easiest, best defined problems first. For the harder, less defined issues, that some of them I've outlined, some of them aren't even on the list yet. Initiate the open discussion and gather some broad input. And again, revisiting projects, other projects that have maybe similar projects and problems, and see how they're doing it. Always useful. And then I think I'd like to come back at either quarterly or at least by the mid-year and assess the progress of this slide 9, where we have gotten to, and adjust the list accordingly. If we're already through most of it, add more to the list. If we're not through most of it, I guess either hustle or readjust. But that was all I was going to talk about today. I have recently refreshed my fork of OMR and started building and running tests again. But I didn't get as far as being able to set up a Jenkins job for the perf tests so that I could show things and what that Google test output looks like. Hoping to get to that within January timeframe. Did anyone have questions or hope for more? You might notice that JIT test I've left off my list of specific test enhancements. I was looking at areas of the project didn't have as much activity. I think there's been lots of good progress in the JIT test area in the past year already. So I was trying to address some of the other areas, but totally happy to adjust the list or hear what people have to say. And I'll stop talking now and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Shelley. You mentioned the JIT testing. I guess about a year ago, last November 2018, I think we had a discussion at this architecture meeting about Trill and I guess sort of the directions of it and wish lists and that sort of thing. So there is an issue that was created that sort of outlines a lot of these pieces of work that we wanted to take Trill. I don't think we've made huge progress on some of those fronts, but we're not standing still, but it's just.
I remember that issue. I should have put it, I'll maybe revise my slides to put it in because it looked like a wonderful list. I know that Leo has made some progress on even portability and some recent stuff that has happened this past term with Anne's work. So yeah, I don't mean to not have it on the list because it's not important. I just meant it seemed that other people were already carrying that forward a little. So things that look neglected.
What is the, I don't know much about the Google performance test framework. So is that just sort of a wrapper around some tests that actually will run it and measure time over how long it takes to execute, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's actually a really sweet plugin. So you need Google Test to be able to use the benchmark portion. And yeah, it is actually just a wrapper. So it's quite easy. It's just like Google Test where you'd wrap you'd include a certain header and you'd wrap your test with certain pieces here. There's a lot of great documentation for it already. And I guess one of the other interesting things, a couple of the other interesting things I like about it are that you can vary what type of output it produces. So it has a pretty print to the console if you're just running it directly, but it can produce JSON and CSV for being able to feed into other systems and be read easily. So it seems very nice. It is what LLVM uses for their benchmarking pieces as well. It's pretty well used out in the world. So there are other tools that you could consider taking advantage of if you use this. And since we were already using Google Test, it plugs in fairly nicely. It seemed like the right fit. So I guess, yeah, anyone can just go to this repo here and take a look. But I'll try to actually I'll create a fork and do some simple experiments and around just so people can take a look at what the flow might look like. So if we have benchmark testing, I presume the flow of that could be that we run those in a separate job in Jenkins in a regular basis, and then TRS or some other tool, if you choose something else, can monitor those builds and store the stuff over time so you can start to see trends. And you may or may not want that as part of a pull request build. I doubt that you would want it as part of a pull request build. But I know at the moment the current set of tests that's in there, the small set, doesn't take any time to run. This, in my mind, this is a separate job that runs weekly or something, depending on how many resources available. And I probably am going to need to bother some people regarding my lack of knowing of CMake and that kind of stuff. But there's people.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know we had trouble building Google tests on ZOS. So yeah. I think we should probably try the Google benchmark to get a building there first. And if that works, then we should be good for other platforms.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see that it has a fairly good set of documentation and a rich set of features. But yeah, I think some of that preliminary stuff I'll try to schedule into definitely the first quarter. I will probably need some people's help in terms of lifting some of the stuff up and getting me up to date on things that have happened in the project over the last year that I probably haven't paid close attention. And if you start to already have ideas for other ways or other metrics we should be gathering information on, please feed into that issue. Actually, that one's probably for conversion. We could probably put an epic just talking about perf testing.
I mean, one thing that's come up more than once over the past few years has been not just throughput performance tests, but memory performance testing as well. So how much footprint are you consuming and that?
Exactly. Yeah, and I hope that people didn't think perf test can mean lots of things. Honestly, it might just as well be called tests you want to monitor over time. So, what metrics do you want to measure over time to see a trend? I think we could broaden the scope of things a little bit. Yeah.
Compile time is one that I'd be interested in seeing us measure on a more regular basis at the OMR layer, just so that we, because right now I don't think we have very good observability of what the impact of changes that we're making in the compiler have on compile time. Really.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
And it only pops out at some point, some performance benchmark that somebody else is watching something else, and compile time is, you know, implicated in some other kind of performance problem that's been observed. But
yeah, and even you know, for what we started using TRSS, also for you can create alerts essentially. So one of the things we now watch for are what's the execution time of any one of the functional test suites. If it goes up by an unexpected amount, kind of make an alert about that. So I don't know if that ever happens in the very fast running functional tests of OMR, but or if it would be meaningful, but it certainly happens at the Java layer.
Should we set up pager duty, Shelley?
As long as you're holding the pager.
OMR GC test took too long. I'll tell you where that pager is going, in a glass of water.
Yeah, I'm not gonna volunteer for pager duty. All right. Any other questions? I mean, I don't wanna continue on. There's lots of other stuff, I think, but I wanted to keep containment around any kind of 2020 plans from my side of things, that we actually accomplish them. But I am very interested in this, and I'm since the last couple of days, last week, I've kind of been revisiting all this stuff. I'm actually pretty stoked. So. Kind of
What were you thinking about using for the code coverage measurements? Were you just going to use the like the GCov? And
yeah, we had used GCov in the past. Of course, now everything's CMake, so I don't know if it's going to be easier or more difficult for that. One of the other things is there's lots of tools out there now. We played around with them for some of the other projects where you could actually run coverage as part of a pull request, so it gives you a visual indicator of your current coverage. We could look at doing that for the project, but for now I was just going to stay very simple, reproduce kind of the thing we had before, and compare numbers. Later we could add some bells and whistles and see, but I don't know that, you know, maybe you can tell me this, answer this question. Essentially, if there's a new feature going into OMR, are you likely to see it going in without any testing? Probably not. Maybe I'm wrong.
ideally, no. I mean, but
and then some.
Certainly not at the point where the optimizer is properly.
Yeah. And then some features in OMR, like some components, obviously the JIT component, our code coverage numbers probably aren't so useful. So tying it in as a part of the PR, you know, plugin or having a visual thing at that point is maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, from a compiler perspective, I don't think that the testing mechanisms that we have in place at the moment are powerful enough to force all the paths that need to get exercised in the compiler or the back end of the compiler.
Yeah, and I think some of those concerns are captured in the issue Leo created, right? For the JIT.
There's a need for quite a lot more sophisticated stuff for the optimizer.
Yeah, like Trill, I think, is one component, but ultimately even Trill by itself will not be enough, because there's a lot of parts that I'm not even sure it will make sense to try to represent in Trill.
Yeah.
Right? Trill is kind of really just about materializing IL from a string without having to go through some intermediate bytecode.
Right.
So I think that there's definitely improvements that can go into Trill, but there's more work even just in the compiler itself that needs to happen so that we can expose some of the things that we want to test.
Right. And obviously I also didn't put on this list any of the kind of fuzz testing concepts, because again, I was trying to stick with realistic goals for 2020. But I do think that by just starting to touch on these first set of things, even just adding documentation, even just running some metrics and starting to look with more scrutiny at each one of the components, that it's just going to lead to more things to put on the list. So yeah, if some of this initial stuff helps trigger more of the conversation, I think it'll probably be worth back to this topic in a couple months and see now what does it look like and how things have progressed in all these areas. Yeah, I specifically didn't. I felt like some of that, testing the optimizer could be down in the undefined part of this list at the moment. So going from most defined down. But maybe I'm probably wrong because I haven't reached out to a whole lot of people to.
There's a huge proportion of the PRs. I'm not trying to say that other components are not updating, but there are a lot of PRs made against the compiler component in OMR. If you look at the distribution of the components that pull requests are made against,
Yeah,
the compiler is certainly right up there in terms of the number of changes being submitted, right?
So maybe this should, it probably then needs us to raise that in priority, because I think, obviously, one of the goals is to de-risk the dev team and the project. So if that is actually the case, where there's a lot more changes happening, I probably need to come back and throw some things onto this 2020 list, or at least get that started.
So one of the...
I thought Leo was going to do it.
Poor Leo.
So
yeah,
one of
the price of being capable.
Yeah, there was a professor that I knew who's my favorite quote from him was that competence breeds overwork.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that makes sense. That's why if someone ever asks you to paint a fence, do a terrible job of it.
Noted.
All right. Well, I think so. Yeah. Okay. This was where I was sitting at things right now, but obviously I hadn't reached out, and the moment you start talking with people, you get 1,000 more things to put on the list. I'm happy to create some kind of larger list, but I will still start with the very simple stuff, getting some doc in, turning on some of the existing stuff we have that is running, lifting some of that stuff up. But really, when I said, I think I started looking just at the directory structure and started saying, well, what things would I actually do? Here, I would make sure to run code coverage and look specifically at certain things and fill gaps. For each one of these things, I think we can look very closely at each directory here. Obviously, again, I think up in the top of the list was reorganizing this directory and possibly renaming it. So each one of these things should be scrutinized as we kind of go through and clean up stuff. There's some stuff in here that I don't actually know what it is because it's new to me from the long time ago that I looked at.
Okay. Do you have a question? Well, it's not so much a question, and I don't think it's even necessarily that something that Shelley specifically needs to think about. But one of the things that I've become more aware of, having worked with the OWL sub-project, the side project that happened, and various other things, is that we now have a number of, well, we have more downstream consumers of OMR, right? We have LLJB, we have OpenJ9, of course, we have WASM, the WASM JIT, we've got several other downstream.
We've got NJ, we've got Ravi, we've got...
Right, there's a bunch of stuff. Now, one of the things that I'm growing more concerned about is that when we're doing changes in the compiler, especially to APIs, and as we start to try to evolve towards some kind of API stability, or we're looking at doing API refactoring even after we declare alpha stability, whatever that means, right? That there's not a very easy way at the moment for somebody sitting in OMR to know which dependents, which downstream projects.
Who did I just break?
Yeah, am I going to break? Like, who do I need to go and talk to and or be nice to and or go and help with whatever it is that I'm doing? And there isn't really a pathway that I see at the moment in how we're talking about testing or anything like this that would help alleviate that problem. Now, I would certainly not advocate bringing in those sub-projects tests directly into OMR. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But if there were a way for these projects to register, I don't know, a one or two tests, or a way, like a script or something that would let
Shelley
you...
has some ideas on this.
Yeah, which would let you kind of do a dead-on arrival kind of thing, like just the minimal, does it compile, does it start, right? Does it run minus version or whatever?
And tell you that it's not different than the higher level projects. So from the, again, using the example, it is slightly, obviously, because the mechanism may need to be more sophisticated, but for the higher level project, there's two ways we connect to make sure either we don't break them or they don't get broken because of something. So the one way is to actually take a very small set of the stuff into the project and run it regularly, because that's easy to do. It just needs resources. Now, you could be more careful and say, I don't want to run the full suite of their tests. I want to measure and look at where we normally break and just pick a very smart set, or look at what has changed and determine in a smarter way what tests out of those higher level ones to run, or those consumers. But the other way we do it, or we're going to start to do it, is at the high level project, the adopt project, is you know, if you're consuming us and you are running tests with us underneath, have a relationship so we can go and help monitor and see what's going on. So though this is undefined at the moment, we were talking about this when Leo was down, not last time, but the time before. Is there a subscription model that we could put in place that says, depending on how these consumer projects are picking you up, can we make it dead easy for them to run a set of tests that then we can monitor and know, oh yeah, here we go. So it's owned in their, you know, in their servers or CI setup, but we actually can relate it back to everybody. I don't know. I know how to do it at the higher level projects. I wanna, now that you just said a long list of these projects, I'm glad, because that's something that's quite well defined. Here's the set that we care about, because now we have something to look at, and now we have something more real than we'd like to not break them. And
well, I don't know that it should be the OMR project itself that necessarily defines what the subset is that we care about, right? It's more like if somebody is a consumer and they would like to be informed, like when somebody is doing one of these experiments, like I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do to the optimizer or whatever, and there's a risk that it's either not going to build or it's going to be functionally dead on arrival if you've extended it in certain ways. Is there an easy way for me to run a set of tests and then go, right, these are the people that are going to be affected by this change so that I can go and talk to them and or go and help them? Like trying to answer that question, because like LLVM unfortunately has a model, well, for a long time had a model where it's they refactor and commit, and then everybody downstream suffers until such times as everybody else has figured out A, what they did, and then B, done whatever they did to their code.
Yeah.
And the spirit that's been occurring, and at least the compiler component of OMR, has been trying to be a bit nicer in that if we realize that we're doing something that is going to affect people downstream, we try to tell the people downstream and do the change in a more collaborative manner, right? If your head is following something close to our head, let's work together to try and not break you. And then knowing the set of people that you might need to talk to, I think is a challenge, right? Because like as any one developer who's working on OMR and probably one or more downstream projects, you're not going to know all the projects. So
yeah, exactly. But you might care about some a great deal. So the way we did it, there's no way in this example for me to run every Java application's functional suite. But there are some Java applications functional suites that we really care about because they exercise a whole lot of stuff. So I'm thinking of it from what helps me at this project is to select some of these consumers and include them in our own stuff. Anything else, the way we're going to do it is offer consumers a model where if they're taking our stuff and using it in their runs, we'll still be able to do that. And we can actually go, you can just register and we'll monitor that and we'll track it a different way. So we have this tool that can go and monitor builds off of any Jenkins server, off of any Azure DevOps, any place where other projects may be running stuff as long as it's public. And we can kind of gather that. So that's the model for the higher level stuff. I believe there's probably a way we can approach this from the OMR layer as well. And I know that this is, something that other projects that are kind of similar to us also think about and do. So how do you plug in external suites to make it easy? You might still not include them in your PR testing, or because you have resource limitations, only run them every week or something. But is it easy to plug it in? So that's one of the things that is this thing on the list. Define test mechanisms. So very ill-defined at the moment, but I am very interested in this one. So yeah, I think it requires more time than I've devoted to prepping for this meeting to maybe make some proposals or throw some ideas into an epic. But I'd like to get this going this year for sure. And I think it will help protect OMR developers. Because then you'll go, I don't know what are all the things I need to think about. But luckily, we have some mechanisms in place that are going to help me a little. Yeah, but it's a good point.
Okay.
It's definitely more input.
Shelley, are you also interested in talking about longer term kinds of test initiatives that we probably don't even know how necessarily to do them yet? Might require a research project to investigate. Would want like start looking at things like how you do coverage for compiled code and those kinds of things.
Well, I'm definitely interested in that. Where did it go here? I don't know if we captured this. there were some ideas back early on when we were starting some of that work with working with the JIT team, with you in particular, that I haven't paid attention where we're at with it. The notion of being able to read back in things, and obviously Trill and all this other stuff has come a long way, but I think there were lots of other things on the list at the time we were talking about this. I'm absolutely interested to come back into this. As you know, we also have the CAS project, Deepsmith project as well. Can we take that same approach and apply deep learning to generate IL or something else? Again, I also want to take a look at probably what are because I think different JVMs and implementations have different approaches to this. There's, I guess, some fuzz testing options for the command line for our hotspot stuff and different things. So I haven't looked at all of the possibilities, the bigger future items. All right, wasn't going to bring it to this meeting, but I definitely am interested in this. Like, since we started working, with the University of Edinburgh, we've gotten all into some research on best practices for differential testing. We've gotten into how to write code that's easier to fuzz. So that's another interesting take, right? Maybe there's a better way to write some of the code in this project so that we can actually fuzz test easier. So I think that, yeah, there's probably a very long list. I didn't take this into for 2020 though. I'm happy to if there are folks on this call or in that, or collaborators that you're already working with that have this. I definitely want to be part of that conversation. Just trying to see if I had some of the papers that were sent to me recently, but I won't bother bringing them to this one. I'll try to create a Slack conversation around some of that stuff, maybe.
Okay.
I'm on the OMR Slack channel, so.
You could also create, for all of this testing work, you could actually create an epic in the OMR, right? And start to define a roadmap here of the things you have here, but also add some of the longer term.
The longer term goals? Yeah, I definitely will.
All right, any more questions for Shelley or comments? Okay. All right, well, thanks very much, Shelley, for laying out some of those ideas for 2020.
Yeah. Sorry if they look modest. But if folks are keen to work directly together on stuff, reach out to me, and I will create an epic in the project. And I think I mean, I have this on my regular schedule now. Unless it conflicts, I'll be joining this call regularly. To work.
Okay, great.
Closely with folks. Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Shelley.
Thanks, Shelley.
Bye.